Right, I think we're going to be ready to start. So thank you very much for joining us for, I guess, the second part of the Night of Ideas. As I said in my introduction, there's two sides. There's the potential doom and gloom as to where the world is going, and the potential for machines to save the world and save everything. So we're going to move into the second part, which is talking about technology. I said at the introduction, this is my third year being the MC at the Night of Ideas. And actually, I do have another day job, and my other day job is exactly what we're going to be talking about now. So I really look forward to understand. And they're looking at me going, because, you know, was it about social media? Now, this is going to be about artificial intelligence. And my day job is to look after the digital audit team at PwC. And so what we do is find ways to automate how we do audit. So maybe you'll talk about that. And my kids describe it as, Dad, are you going to replace people's jobs? So I said, no, we're going to make it easier for people. They're not going to have to do the boring stuff. So that's really, the heart of what I do. And I think the next panel will be really exciting. It will be able for us to explore machine learning, what artificial intelligence is going to do to help us have a better world, hopefully. And so with this, I'd like to invite on stage Greg Williams, who's the editor of Wired UK, which he joined in 2010 after a decade of publishing industry in New York. And then the three panelists, we've got Gaspard Koenig, Mercedes Bunz, and Lorena Jaume-Palasi. So if you could come on stage, and I'll let Greg introduce you properly. Thank you very much.
Welcome. How are you?
Very well.
Good. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to start the clock because we have an hour, and I've been told we mustn't run over. Welcome to what I think, from what I heard in the green room, is going to be a nice, urgent and spirited conversation. So I'm just going to say a couple of words to begin, really just from kind of the Wired perspective. I think the big kind of top-line view that we have at the moment is that the world is obviously undergoing this kind of big transformation from the technologies of, I guess, the sort of, post-war era, the microprocessor, to technologies that are far more complicated, that are much more sophisticated. And what we're going to see over the coming years is probably a transformation that was as dramatic as the move from the agrarian revolution through to the industrial age. We're going to be seeing this occurring over the next sort of 5 to 10 to 20 years. And this is obviously going to have a fundamental sort of transformational effect on the world. If you look at the most valuable companies in the world 20 years ago, they would be very similar to the most valuable companies 20 years before that. So the year 2000, the year 1980, it's probably going to be ExxonMobil, AT&T, a bunch of other companies that are usually kind of energy-based, and maybe even an airline. You look at the most valuable companies in the world today, and obviously they're very different from that. Most of them are based on technology, and so we're the companies of the information age. And I think what's intriguing is that basically within the lifespan of everyone in this room, assuming there's no one here under the age of 20, although you all look incredibly young, that transformation has occurred, and it's been a really dramatic one. So hopefully tonight we're going to, with our three experts, we're going to look at some of the challenges of this. We're going to look at, what does it mean for technologies, algorithms fundamentally that are being written largely by young men in Northern California, how we create ethical codes around that, how we create governance and standards around that, how we're going to start thinking about automation and how our economies are impacted, and how machine learning and its corollaries like facial recognition, it's been in the news this week, as that becomes widely adapted, we find ourselves in a world where it's increasingly hard to know how much agency we have as individuals over control over our own lives. So the way things are going to run, each of the panelists is going to give a brief presentation, about 7 minutes each, and then we're going to get into a group discussion, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So Let's begin. So maybe each of you could, when you begin your presentation, just introduce yourselves and say who you are. Gaspard, maybe you could start.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm a liberal philosopher, and so I want to make clear, first of all, that I'm no expert, and it took me 1 year to travel to so many places who actually do artificial intelligence, from US to China to Israel to Denmark to the UK to France, and try to get the gist of it, talking to people, because that's how I think we should do philosophy. We should go on the ground, we should go in the field, and make those connections that are missing today between philosophy and technology. And then why was I interested into that rather dry subject, in fact? It's just that I read this Homo Deus from Yuval Harari, and I think the question he raised at the end is the right question. It's not about the end of jobs, it's not about superintelligence taking over. I think it's pretty much overstated. It's about what happens for our societies if we increasingly delegate our decision-making capacity to machines. If we presume, rightly or wrongly, that machines know ourselves better than we do, and if obviously we understand that they know our environment, they have more information about environments than we do, then we will entrust them with how we live, how we work, what study we do, who we date, and progressively we will give up on what the Enlightenment had really provided us, which is the sense of the autonomy of judgment. So what happens in a society where you don't make autonomous judgments because you think the machine knows better in every area of life? And you can see that happening already in the US. You have companies that match your profile with a certain type of jobs through machine learning. You don't have to enter any explicit criteria, because an explicit criteria is considered as even deluded, the machine knows you better than what you can formulate. And obviously it will impact different aspects of the way we live in society. It will impact law. That's why some people in Stanford or in the European Commission are already thinking about granting robots a legal personality, because if the robot has taken the decision and not the human, then who is responsible in case of an accident? Where should the insurance go? And so it's quite logical that in that world, you lose the sense of agency in the legal way, also in the economic domain, also in the democratic sphere, right? And most people in the Silicon Valley are really convinced that a society would be better run if those companies, those big techs, were actually in charge of healthcare and transportation, as they do in China. So that was my main concern. And I think that concern goes, what I discovered, I think, is that concern is also going against an intellectual backdrop, especially in the US, that negates the notion of free will. So you have a combination of psychology, and obviously Daniel Kahneman comes to mind, and very popular in the Valley, by the way, who tells you that, in fact, we are full of cognitive biases, so we don't know what we really want. Behavioral economics, who gives a justification for nudging people, since people are not rational, but we will nudge them for what's better for them. And then neurosciences, which tell you that even the most possibly rational decision you can make is something we can map, and that we know your decision before you've even formulated it. The combination of all those different sciences make it hard to resist the idea that free will is just a sort of metaphysical remnant of the Middle Ages. And let's be serious, we're all determined by biochemical processes, and so we will nudge people into what's best for them, because we cannot trust their own judgment. And so obviously AI fits in very well into that world. I certainly don't have time to show you all the slides, but there is one which I find interesting. It's a startup that I met in Los Angeles, and it's been created by a former neuroscientist. And their motto is very simple. The brain is programmable, you just need the code. Right? And so what they do is that they sell instruments to apps in order to make their users addict. And they say it's very simple, and you can calculate the likelihood of people getting addicted to an app. And you just provide them with the right notifications, with the right thumbs up, with the right like, with all sorts of devices that are obviously personalized. And that's what machine learning allows you to do, to personalize, and to get under the explicit preference. And the same applies to dating websites. And to make it really, probably to make it really, really short, Yeah, that's Kahneman, if you're interested. Yes, here you go. The intellectual father of AI as we know it today. And so, AI is probably, well, at least machine learning is ideologically neutral. But as it is applied today, as it is commercially applied, taking in the data of users and then nudging them back, it's probably something that indeed increases the sentiment of heteronomy, as opposed to autonomy of judgment. And that really sort of wipes out the tenets of our liberal societies that believe in individual responsibility, and that's my concern as a liberal philosopher. And so what I think we should do about it is not move away from the technology. I mean, I met people actually in Berlin, who do that, who try to create their own bubbles. They have this method called obfuscation, where they create clones of themselves on the social networks in order not to be identified, not to be traced, right, but that will only apply for a minority of very aware, activist individual. But what do you do for the masses? What do you do for society? So what you need to do, very simple. Let's go jump to the last slide. Yeah. So they share some capillary, obviously, similarities. And these are the people I met whom I think are the most interesting in terms of solutions and ways forward. To make it really short, the first one on the left is Daniel Dennett. And Daniel Dennett is an American philosopher and wrote a lot about free will and how you accommodate the notion of free will in a deterministic universe. So obviously you take into account the results of neurosciences, and there's no reason to object to that. But his point is that you can be in the deterministic universe and still assert the notion of individual responsibility through the capacity that we have to make internal deliberation. So what counts is not the outcome of your deliberation, it's the fact that you do deliberate. And even if that choice is suboptimal for the rest of your community, even if it leads to mistakes, this is your choice. And so that constitutes you as a singular human being, and that's what we should protect. But you should address that notion of free will before you move into the realm of public policy. And then there is this, on the very top right, there is Jaron Lanier. And Jaron Lanier is, for me, a fantastic technological master of technology and technology policy. And his whole point is, yes, obviously we get into those filter bubbles and those nudges. Why? Because we provide data, and we provide data for free. So what you would need to do in order to regain that free will we were talking about is to actually own your own data and decide for yourself who you share your data with, and at which condition, and at which price. And that's why I'm pleading at the end of the book, and that's the conclusion of my journey through artificial intelligence, I'm pleading for property rights on personal data. I mean, mind you, at every stage of the evolution of capitalism, we expanded property rights in order to protect the individual against any form of centralized authority. It started with the peasants that were granted the right to own their own land. And I think we are now with the big platforms, we're really in a feudal system where we give everything for free, and in exchange we get, well, we give everything and in exchange we get free services, but there is no contract. So there is no, in fact, economic, contractual capitalist relationship. And then when we invented the printing press, a few centuries later, we expanded property rights to authorship. And then during the Industrial Revolution to intellectual property. And I think it's quite logical that now we move into the realm of personal data, which are not subject to property rights right now. I mean, the aggregation of data is. That's why Facebook can make money out of your data, and you don't get anything in return because the value has not been calculated. So Jaron Lanier is a big proponent of that. And I think there is an economic element, obviously, to say, well, now the value that we produce is not being remunerated by the big platform. But there is a more fundamental metaphysical point, because with property rights, you have fructus, okay, you can make money out of it, fine. But you have also usus and abusus, meaning you can use and destroy your own data as you would wish so. Okay. So what we could imagine is to have a sort of smart contract in place where you decide the terms and conditions under which you want your data to be used. And obviously the more transparent you are, the more you get financial reward for it. The more close you are, because you want to stay private, then the more you have to pay to access those services.
Okay.
So you introduce a bilateral, contractual, classical economic relationship, which make it much healthier. Because then you will upload your free will up front. You will say, okay, I want to be nudged in certain areas, within certain criteria. For shoes, I have no problem. I share all my data and you give me the best shoes. For geolocalization, I don't want to be traced ever. For health data, under certain conditions, for research purposes, and so on. And you will attach those terms and conditions on each of the data that you emit. And so you, in that case, you wouldn't click on the terms and conditions of the platforms. The platforms would come and click on your terms and conditions, and then that will trigger a certain, of course, economic relationship. And then you would say, okay, but you're alone against a big platform. How will you do that? Well, obviously, once you grant property rights, there will be intermediaries. And it's no surprise that banks and insurance companies are already looking into that, saying, well, we will take care of your data, and we will make sure that you get your contracted terms that you want, and then we will negotiate with the rest of the industry.
I have strict instructions that we run on time, and I'm afraid.
And so the last person, which I think is useful for us, is Margrethe Vestager, who frankly is exactly along those lines, because she's a good social liberal, as the Scandinavians can do, and it makes sense, right? That data ownership goes with antitrust policies, because then when you regain your data and you can transfer them from one system to another, it of course increases competition and so your capacity to choose. So, to conclude, I think the major issue with machine learning as it is deployed today commercially is the notion of the autonomy of judgment that affects many areas of our societies, that part of the solution lies into ownership rights, gain ownership of those data and then decide where you want to be nudged. And that's something that Europe could very well do. And that's the logical continuation of GDPR, in fact.
Okay. Thank you so much. We need to move on. Mercedes, I think you're next. Yeah.
I'm going to have to stand, not just so that you all stay awake, but I think otherwise I can't read my slides. Right. I'm going to continue from that a little bit and go a bit in another direction. I continue with the theme of AI, but I'm talking a bit more about how AI. I mean, you all probably texted today someone. So you all have used AI because text recognition and the spelling help is definitely driven by an artificial intelligence program. But I'm going to try a bit to understand. So in my research, I'm a senior lecturer at King's College London. My name is Mercedes Bunz, and I'm quite interested where we position AI and how we misunderstand it. So at the moment, I have 2 research projects, and I will talk a little bit about them. One is about will machine learning relocate medical knowledge? That looks at a bit what Gaspard said about the data that we give and who can have the data. And the other one is a creative AI lab with the Serpentine galleries. But I will start to ask a question, and I'm very happy I'm in the Institut Français because I want to start to ask a question with Laurent Gourand, who was a French anthropologist, and he writes about very often where is human intelligence situated. And the intelligence of the human thought cannot be situated in the brain alone, is one of his theses. He says it extends to the tool we think and work with, and by this he means tools as well as language. So where would intelligence be in a world, for example, where there are no books and nothing can be written down? Very, very different from where we are and sit now. So we can ask ourselves, where's our intelligence in a world with machine learning? How does it change? How is it very different? And that's one question where we go into. So where do we currently locate our new tool of intelligence, machine learning? How do we analyze AI? What's the role of AI in the medical discourse? Where do we see the intelligence in the medical discourse? And we did a bit of a research. We looked into newspaper articles of 3 journals from 1980 to 2020. The Wall Street Journal, the Daily Telegraph, and the Guardian, to have 3 of different political background. And we looked at mentions of AI and doctor and seen how do we as a society negotiate where intelligence is. And the quite interesting thing, I mean, you can see we start writing about AI in 1984, and it has massively, since machine learning came up around 2014, been published about more and more. So we have 365 articles, and most of them want to kick the doctor out. So the tendency from the very first one, which is 1984, is already expert system software finds place in daily office routine. In the article, they say the system could replace the doctor. And then I brought you a few headlines. AI system spots childhood disease like a doctor. London hospitals to replace doctor and nurses with AI. How machine learning is putting a doctor in your pocket. And could machines use artificial intelligence make doctors obsolete? So it's very, very clear that the tendency of this discourse is to automate the whole human doctor, push it out, and replace it with a machine. Now, the interesting thing is, this goes even if you look at reports, that's not just something you find in newspapers where you find then something like thinking on its own AI in the NHS. And if you look at the public sector, it's not much better. So in public perception, we have films like Ex Machina or Terminator. And again, the AI is an agency that automates and that sort of is threatening us, it's against us, it's automating us, it pushes us out. But once, my clicker's not working. Let's see if the AI works. It's always so funny. Yeah, I think maybe the battery ran out. Maybe it works with you. Yeah, so my question is, but I need a clicker. You can also click for me if you want to. Is this real? Like that we are all getting automatized when even the clicker does not work most of the times. So how we discuss and depict technology, does this correspond to how it actually works? So some of my work is to look at how do we discuss something and how does it look when we look into the technological functions. So some of you might know a bit about neural networks and machine learning, but I think it's quite important to explain it very shortly. So one very big difference between human intelligence and machine learning intelligence is you can tell a child this is a cat, and one cat is enough for a child to understand this is a cat and to identify cats their own. This wouldn't work for machine logic. Machine learning needs thousands of examples to understand what a cat is. So it's a very, very different form of intelligence, even though we always pretend it's like nearly human intelligence. And it's quite interesting to see that here in this display, you see the first nodes where it starts to learn. Here goes the data in. It looks at something that's really weirdly shaped. And that's quite important because it really can only see edges, dark to light, light to dark. It cannot see forms or anything. So this is a visualization tool that looks into a neural network, into the input image, and you can see some nodes see nothing because the nodes look at really, really very minimal differences, light to dark, dark to light, shifts in color. They can't see a thing. They only see edges and shifts in pixels. And that's quite important because we come from this really difficult seeing. We have trained them so well so that they can identify images very well. So this is from the ImageNet challenge. That's from 2016, I think. It's much better now, but you can see that the pictures got recognized correctly. Little girl is eating piece of cake. Baseball player is throwing ball in game, woman is holding a bunch of bananas, and so on. But this is my favorite. A young boy is holding a baseball bat. Or a cat is sitting on a couch with a remote control. Or the last one is a horse is standing in the middle of a road. Of course, there's no horse. It has gotten much better since then, but the general problem remains that we can see here. This is a recent paper that came out at the University of Tübingen in Germany, and they found out that because machine learning sees so well, when it does image recognition, it is very easily tricked because they are biased towards texture. So we see here very clearly a cat, and the machine learning is very, very certain this is an elephant because the cat is built in the form of an elephant. And because machine learning only sees those little edges, of course it thinks this is an elephant. This is quite important when it comes how machines can be tricked. This is a photo of a cat. In the beginning, the computer is very sure it's a tabby cat. It is, has different tiger cats and so on. It could be a carton and could maybe be a swab or a mop or a pot of flowers, but it is quite sure by 85% it's a tabby cat. The last one, in this image, just some pixels have been changed. The computer is nearly 100% sure it's guacamole. This is the picture it identifies. So this is quite important to understand how different machine learning works. And I don't want to give this talk to be against machine learning, because I actually think it's really quite a good technology. But I think we need to understand that the intelligence of machine learning interprets our world by looking at the smallest element and calculating meaning statistically. Now that is quite extraordinary. We couldn't calculate meaning ever before. The fact that we can process meaning, images and language, is a unique step in human evolution, so to speak. But it is also not that it understands meaning, it processes meaning, and that's a very difference. So we have problems like this, that self-driving cars are driving into pedestrians, or Tesla autopilots go mad on the street because they miss something. And one thing that we need to ask ourselves, if we keep on discussing AI as an autonomous agent, even though it has really mistakes, whose interests are safeguarded by this discourse? Why do we have it to automate things completely? Why can't we just have it as an assistant that helps us in doing some things better? And yeah, so the questions we can maybe discuss later is, who profits from us misunderstanding such an important technology? I am trying to work, and these are my last 2 slides, we try to work with a crew of artists if we can embrace the brittleness of our systems and their specific intelligence by understanding their strengths and limits in our workings with technology. And we try to replace the idea of autonomous agents with the idea of collaboration. And the question that we have, because you might have heard that a lot of times artificial intelligence is this black box. How can we open that? What kind of interfaces could enable an intelligent collaboration? But one problem that we all have is we want this collaboration. We need to start learning a bit more how it functions, and that's quite a bit of work. So yeah, let's see if this happens.
All right.
So I'm the last one, and I do have only one slide. Hello everyone, my name is Lorena Jaume-Palasi, and I'm an ethicist, and I work at the intersection of technology and ethics. That means that I try to fool technology around to understand where are the ethical gaps in it, or that I think about what it means at a normative level. This means that I also have to talk a lot with politicians and with lawyers, trying to understand and make them understand how the gaps that we have intersect with law. And I brought you, because it all starts with the question of what is a decision. This is what, when we talk about ethics, when we talk about law, when we talk about agency, we need to first understand, okay, who's an agent, who's responsible? Just to pick up on the last question that you were putting on the table, Gaspard. And I just brought you this slide. This is a visualization. Can it run? Can you please run it? No, I think. Can you click on it? Yeah, but it's interactive. It has a link, and you're not able? Okay, so I will try to explain what this video was supposed to do. So what you see up there is this red thing. This is a program. And this program is a program that is used to train autonomous cars. So this is a program about autonomous driving. This is a visualization of what we call genetic algorithms. This is what we call nowadays AI. This is quite sophisticated. And what the machine does, as you can see, is it sends fictitious cars, and they move around until they crash to the wall. And you see there's a lot of cars. And it memorizes when was the last point in the wall where it crashed against. So it basically sends cars that crash and crash and crash, and through crashing through the wall makes it way out until they found the door. Now imagine your daughter or your son learns to walk like that. Would you think it is intelligent or it's cognitively challenged? What they do, those machines, is not making decisions. They do not learn. Because for a decision to be taken, both from the ethical perspective and from the legal perspective, you need first intentionality. Those machines do not have an intention. Then it needs certain parameter of freedom. If you're doing things because someone is about to kill you, or you don't have time enough, or you are not rational enough because you are under substance abuse, or because you have some cognitive challenges, then you cannot be held to any type of responsibility, and you're not considered as someone doing something, deciding something. None of them applies to this. So we don't talk about decisions here, we talk about programs that run and execute decisions that have been made in advance by a group of people that construct this type of programs. So those is some sort of to say it's conserved decisions that are being executed afterwards, independently of the context where these programs are being used. This is what is happening. And what that means is that artificial intelligence, which is not intelligent, is actually doing something that is challenging our societies, but not in terms of substitution of our capacities as human beings, as intelligent beings, but because it's mapping things in a different way. When we talk about algorithmic systems, which is basically what we call AI or artificial intelligence, which is rather more cultural term that really doesn't depict what it is about, what we're talking. What we do is we translate processes, social processes, into mathematical language. We talk about socio-technical systems, and this translation into mathematics, let us don't fool ourselves. It's a translation into a different language, but a language. And equally to other languages, it has its own implications about the world. It has its own implications about what is the standard that I need to put here. And when we talk about personalization in this context, what it technically means with these machines is not that you're getting individualized services, but that this type of technology is laying a fine layer of infrastructure, of immaterial infrastructure based on categories. And with those categories, those are very fine granular categories where people are being classified in a more granular way that they've been ever classified before. So it gives you the impression that this is an individualized service, but it's actually a program that is putting you in a specific drawer, a very specific drawer than ever before, together with many other people. Because this type of automatization processes in the very end is based on average. And according to one of the famous mathematicians that wrote this book, Do Dice Play God? Do Dice Play God? In average, every human being has a testicle and a breast. Because the average does not understand individuals. It's about finding the common denominator within a group. So this technology is very much about understanding things from an architectonical point of view, from an infrastructural point of view. It's about understanding the roots, so to say. And now the challenge comes, because in our societies, in Western societies, in the end of feudalism, we started thinking to contest power by bringing a different narrative to the power that we have been legitimating before. Autocracies would say, if we want a good city, we need the good citizen. This meant that citizens had to be moral beings, and they had first obligations, and derivated from those obligations, they had some rights. Now, constitutionalism changed that narrative and said, okay, if we want the good city, we need first to grant all citizens rights so that they can cooperate with each other and trust each other. And out of those rights, some obligations are derivated. That's a narrative change. But what happened there in this discourse, that part, granting rights, became the purpose, but actually was the instrument to get a society in peace and stability. The purpose in the very end was the very same purpose that autocracies had, to have a good society. But we forgot about that. In democracy, we started thinking that the purpose of a democracy is to grant everyone individual fundamental rights. And we forgot that our societies are more than the sum of all individual interests. And we started to create our own democratic woods by concentrating on the single trees. Societies are more than the sum of its individuals, in the same way that woods are more than the sum of all trees. And this is the reason why philosophers like Philippa Foot or Richard Sennett or Habermas would point at our incapacity as individuals in our nowadays democracies to not only understand that individuals need to be put in the middle, but also understand that in our societies there is also a collective dimension, that there is a public interest dimension that cannot be addressed with individual normativity, neither with individual ethics nor with individual law. But our law is very much based on the individual. If you go and you want to address something, you need to prove at an individual level that you as an individual have been harmed. But there's a lot of harm that will happen with this type of technology that you cannot understand and address if you look at a single tree. You need to look at the forest. So this is the challenge that we're going to have in our societies. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's a lot to chew on here. A lot there in terms of the challenges we face, just to understand the technology and the very kind of nature of the technology. Gaspard, maybe I can sort of start with you. From what you were describing in your travels, to me, a lot of what you seem to be saying is that there's a kind of like a tension to some degree between kind of like a European model and maybe a US model, certainly kind of like a kind of libertarian US model. Is it the case that really, you know, if you're talking about property rights, Silicon Valley companies are really incentivized not to think about these things, right? They're thinking about solely about delivering profit to shareholders and the fiduciary duty to shareholders. They're not thinking about, you know, property rights, personal data. Have you seen any kind of examples of how this might work in the model that you're describing? It's smart contracts and people and companies actually asking for permission rather than consumers asking for permission.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right to point out that the way the technology is used really depends on the underlying political philosophy of the different world entities, you know, and you can see the difference between Europe, US, and China. We didn't speak about China, but I spent a lot of time in China. I was very impressed about the way they use data. I mean, they just don't care about, well, they see the forest very well in China, but they don't see the tree at all. And so everybody is very happy to share data. They call it the lake of data, in order to benefit the community. What you have to understand about China, I think, is that it's not because they are cynical or because they want to oppress people. It's because they are Confucian. And in the Confucian culture, you share. You share and you are concerned with the well-being of the group. So if you are Alibaba and you're Confucian, it's very right that you share your data with the police in order to catch criminals. Because if you didn't do that, you would be a bad citizen. I went to discuss with engineers of Hangzhou, smart city, city brain as they call it. And they were very candid about it. Right? Of course we share data with the governments because it makes society better. So that's a very clear way how they treat data. Then in the US, yes, you have this sort of libertarian streak, if you wish, that what really matters, well, I would call it utilitarian. It's to maximize the happiness of the maximum number of individuals. And Jaume-Palasi is saying exactly the same. The Silicon Valley is meta-utilitarian. And what that means is that what counts is the well-being of the community, which is why Google Maps doesn't give you the best itinerary for yourself. It gives you the best itinerary for yourself in order also to alleviate the traffic for the rest of the group. That's why I met a Stanford professor who was very proud to tell me that he was beating Google Maps every morning on his way to work. Because he was taking the selfish route, you see? So you see the utilitarian, you see the Confucian. And yes, in Europe, we have this classical liberal model, where the government has always been very active to protect individual rights. I mean, when liberalism was born in the 18th century, it invented the modern state. It was not anti-state. That's the libertarian invention of the 70s. And the government was created to emancipate the individual from intermediary bodies. It was the whole spirit of the French Revolution. And so we could just apply exactly the same principle and say, yes, the government, one of the roles of the government is to grant people property rights. But not for economic reasons, because property rights allow you to deploy your singularity as an individual. I think the base case for property rights is made by Proudhon. Said, in fact, property rights give you a way to resist any form of centralized authority, because you have something that actually really belongs to you and doesn't depend on any external force. Now you're saying, do I see initiatives going into that direction? Yes, very clearly. So from a legal perspective, from a sort of regulatory perspective, this is being discussed quite openly by Margaret Vestager, that property rights and data may be in the agenda of the next European Commission. If you read very carefully her interviews, you see that it's something that is really between the lines. Then there's been a few initiatives in that direction made by startups, small startups. On one hand, wants to monetize your data or allow you to take control of your data, or give you smart wallets, for instance, of data, or even build data cooperatives. Because when you have property rights, you can do capitalism. You can also mutualize your data. Sure. So I'm thinking of a startup in Lyon, which allows you to put your data in a collective pot, and then they negotiate those data with companies, and then you get rewarded with equal rights, as happens in any cooperative. So I think, our sort of market economy institutions are well suited to the age of AI. It's just a question of applying those principles to the new technology, which we haven't done so far.
Okay. In terms of applying principles, Mercedes, I'm interested to get your thoughts. Is part of the challenge here just like an education piece? Like, we don't understand what's going on inside the black box. So demystifying that to some degree is very powerful. Maybe you want to jump in on that as well.
I will link what Gaspard Koenig said a bit to your question, because I think I would, and also to start off the discussion, I would think it's not enough to just say we have the framework that's going on. I think we have left in Europe as well, we're behind sort of a way of understanding public funding as something that's quite important to shape a specific technology. And I think when it comes to machine learning, and that was why I had this slide with all those 1,000 examples of data that needs to go in, the idea of privacy is just one idea that's important. The other idea that's really important is, where does the data come from, where the machine learns from, if we want to call it machine learning or not. So that's the question. If you look, I look at medical algorithms and medical research, and a lot of those medical data comes from companies that create them themselves. Google in the beginning, when they started medical image recognition, had no problem to create 148,000 piece data set, and had it graded each piece by up to 8 doctors, real doctors, not no Amazon Turk. Now you can see how much a day, I mean, some of you have been to private doctors, you know how much an hour by a doctor costs, right? This data set costs about $250,000 to $500,000. If you want to compete as a smaller research institution, as a university, as even a small startup with Google, and on that level, you need access to this data. So one thing, for example, that could be done would be to push more public data banks. It doesn't need to be that you can download it. In medical research, it's quite normal that you apply for it, you show, you sign a contract, everything's secure, and you handle the data sensitive, and then you can use it. But there needs to be an incentive. Now, coming to your question.
So just sorry, one follow-up question on that. So do you think that large tech companies should be encouraged to, create some kind of data commons specifically around medical data?
I think that would be one, but I think we should also encourage the government to create data sets and to invest actively, because we can shape where we want AI and where we want to see machine learning.
Yeah.
But we don't, we leave companies to it. And I think that would also then do the second thing. How do we open up AI? One thing is, if we know which data gets in, it's much more open than if we don't know what trained the machine.
Okay. Lorena, sorry, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Kant was said, I'm master, but not owner of myself, which means that fundamental rights, you own your fundamental rights, but you cannot capitalize them. You cannot capitalize your freedom. You cannot capitalize your dignity. You cannot capitalize your privacy, and so on. So there's one decision that has already been made at European Union level, which is that this type of dimension is not capitalizable because it's a fundamental right. So we need to decide whether we want this to be a fundamental right or not. But it all presupposes that you can point to a specific datum and say, this is mine. But that's not the case. Data is something that happens as a result of our social nature, equal to language. Purporting that you can own data is purporting that you can own language simply because you're speaking. My birth date, it's not only my birth date, it's the date where my mother became my mother, and it's the date when my father became my father, and my sister became my sister. So if my parents want to go and ask for pension to the government, should they ask me for permission to get my birth date into their request? My mental depiction of someone running through the street, being pregnant, what datum is that? Because I am seeing the person, but the person is pregnant. Who owns that datum? It's just trying to think that you can assign this dimension of information and expression of our social interrelatedness is an expression of our individualistic idea to think that we can own and sell things. But there are things in our society that cannot be reduced to economics, and that is just one dimension of that. And of course, yes, these companies have these big data centers, and of course we need to get hold of that situation of big asymmetries with big companies, which, by the way, are not the only ones sort of marking the landscape here in Europe. It's quite different to what we think. We call big tech, and we look and point our fingers to the US and China, but it looks quite different in reality, and I also know that because I work with a lot of them, I talk to a lot of them, and I will go to that later. But for that, what we need to think about this type of technologies, perhaps in a different way, in a less individualistic way. We do know how to look at infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructures, suddenly we know that those are societal issues. Suddenly we know that it's about distribution of mobility. If we go through the highways, it's about distribution and access to energy. If it's about the networks for electricity, water, and so on, or telecommunications. And we know that thinking individually on that term is not going to work. This type of technology is pretty much an infrastructural technology. So if we start thinking of, let's say, Facebook as social infrastructure, what would mean that? That would mean that we would not regulate Facebook as if they were some other e-commerce enterprise entity, because they are not the same that the cheese e-commerce selling entity around the corner, but they are something else. They are social infrastructure. The moment where Facebook suddenly disappears, we all have a problem. Not at an individual social level, but also at a laboral level, and also at an academic level, and in many other levels. It has become, whether we like it or not, a part of our infrastructure. And we're thinking of it in terms of economization, but we're not realizing that we have a level of dependency that requires the legal instruments that we used to apply when it becomes to that type of critical entities. So I do think that instead of thinking of ownership and just bringing it to the individual level, we need to have a more, a bigger rethinking of this type of technology. We're not gonna, this whole example that where you're bringing with, oh, I'm taking the egoistical path with, that person was not taking the most egoistical path. That person was gaming statistics, because statistics is not about the best decision for an individual, but it's on average the best decision.
We now have to turn to, I know you want to respond maybe on Gaspard, but we need to go to questions now from the audience.
That's a fascinating debate. That's exactly the crux of the matter, you know, ownership or socialization of data.
Okay. We need to kind of go to the
Ask
audience.
a
Does anyone have a
question,
question?
please.
Maybe Gaspard, you want to answer that? And anyone raise their hands? Anyone got any questions? No, Gaspard, the floor is yours.
No, I think that's exactly the debate, and that's an argument I heard over and over again. That data should be thought of in terms of formal rights, not in terms of capital. And that's exactly the argument of the European Commission in drafting GDPR, that the individual needs to be protected in terms of formal liberties. You know, that's my right, not, for instance, that the right to be forgotten is a right. It's not something that I can trade. It's not something I can monetize. I think in that reasoning, well, first of all, there is, but that's not the most crucial point. There is a sort of economic denial, because our data, our personal data, are already valued by those big companies, and we just don't get anything in return of the raw materials that we provide. So they are already being monetized. All I ask is that some of the value is returned to the initial producer. But then there is a more interesting philosophical question. That's exactly what you said about Kant and the fact that I don't own myself. And I think that's the debate of the 21st century, is do I own myself? Because the same concept applies to biotechnology. And I would push, and John Locke was the first to have written in his second treatise on political theory that I do own myself. Against what? Against the religious order. Because for St. Paul and the others, you don't own yourself. God owns yourself. And that's exactly at the center of the debate that we have on data and on biotech. Do I own myself? And I think the logic of the modernity, and I know it's painful to hear because of our religious backgrounds, in fact.
I'm an atheist.
Absolutely.
Isn't it
No, you're not.
painful?
You're not. You're part of the same,
Okay,
the same intellectual framework
Let's hear what
that you're
Mercedes has to
denouncing.
say. Let's hear what Mercedes has to say, and then go to you, Lorena.
I think the problem is a little bit, so the argument is out there for quite a while now. Do I own my data? Do I not own my data? And well, it's very clear now that I don't just own my data, but also the one who creates the data structure where it's on has some part. Legally, that's unfortunately simply the case. I think there are two things or several things here, and I think it's quite important that we go away from talking about data in general. I think it is quite important to understand that Facebook is a public sphere, and that we have seen elections from Brexit to Trump where there was interference, and we need to regulate that interference. And it's not even less important if I get my data or not. I signed up to Facebook on free will. You, for example, signed out and deleted your account. That was also your free will, so we can't, say, well, they steal my data. Well, I feed them every day for free. it's my decision. So it's much more complicated than that. But I'm a bit afraid to bring something in completely different, just to entertain you all, that while we're still having this discussion, what to do with my data, the question at the same point is not just about my personal data, but it's really about who owns all the big data sets, and I don't think like Facebook, knows which shoe I like or not. That's important maybe for political, and it's quite important actually for political influence. But it's also about if it comes to medicine, if it comes to education, if it comes to energy, if it comes to all these other transport of everyday life, those companies that have data are stronger than other companies that don't have data. And at the moment, we don't care about who has those data sets that are not big names, Google and so on. And I think we're going away a little bit, we miss a discussion and we miss to interfere with that. And I think that's quite important for the infrastructure point you made, because we are losing the infrastructure to a purely economic infrastructure, while a mixture of both, in my personal opinion, is
I
more
think we're just
interesting.
about to get shut down. Can we do one? Can we do one audience question?
Go on, one last one.
According to my watch, we've still got
very
time.
quick.
Okay, very quick. Second row there.
Sorry, thank you. No, I had one question about like maybe shifting the debate from the data and the owning of the data to actually what we are currently doing with the data, and about deep learning and what, for instance, as you mentioned, what Google is doing. And being in healthcare, I think what's happening right now is amazing, because we're able to process data at a rate that we wouldn't have thought of like 10, 20 years ago. So my question is, like, to me, at least, the ethical debate should also be about like the application of like what we are able to do. And here, there's like in terms of regulatory, right, what the government will be doing, and there will be big differences between different governments. Like for instance, here like Europe, US versus China, and I think it will be important to talk about that too.
Okay, I think that might have to be the
Yeah,
final
I think
thought.
there'll be another.
Great, thank you, the three of you. Fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much.